Hi everyone, it's me, Tim, and today I want to talk about gameplay's influence on story. Moji XOXO asks, how much does gameplay influence what stories are or can be told in video games? How do developers grapple with the tension of a story that wants to do one thing or go a certain way while ensuring that gameplay stays consistently fun and engaging throughout? That is a good question. I think I've touched on this in other videos a bit, but I'll just restate it here. It is very, very challenging for video game narrative designers to stop thinking linearly. Most of them are used to writing stories, whether they're for books or movies or TV shows, and those proceed linearly, where games, at least RPG games, which is what I'm talking about here, do not. Or mine don't. And that's something I want to talk about. So the first red flag to me goes off when I'm having meetings with narrative designers and they say things like, the player goes here and the player does this. And the first thing I say is, what if the player goes there and does something else? What if the player doesn't go there at all? I've literally had narrative designers go, we will force them to go there, and then we will lock them in that space. They cannot leave until they do the thing we want. That does not sound fun to me. And I don't think it sounds fun to you or a lot of other RPG players. So what I usually tell narrative designers is do not think of your story based on player action. Instead, make your story based on player goals, and you don't care how the player does it. For example, don't tell the player to go to the goblin cave and get this item. Just tell the player that I want this item. I want it. If it's not a unique item and the player can go buy it somewhere, or the player can make it, or anything else, that's great. Why would the quest giver care? He just wants the item. Similarly, if you say, hey, this merchant got kidnapped, you need to go rescue him, that's a great goal. And it's a lot better than saying, go to this cave, kill the goblins, and rescue the merchant. Because first of all, it may be fun finding out who kidnapped the merchant in the first place. You may be told, oh, well, we saw goblins, in his shop earlier, and they were arguing. And then someone else may have told you, oh, there's a lot of goblin caves up in the mountains. So that gives you an idea of where to go. But because you weren't told you had to kill the goblins, maybe you go up there and talk them out. Or maybe you pay them. Or maybe they have something they want you to do. Maybe the merchant did something bad to them, and they want you to right that wrong. Whatever it turns out to be, all the person who gave you that quest cares about is that you come back with the merchant. So let the story unfold based on the goal, not the action of the player. In fact, I hate the phrase story-driven game, which is why for the Outer Worlds I kept calling it a player-driven story. Stories don't act. Players act. So another thing you have to do if you're going to follow this, though, is you have to have fallbacks. And I talked about having fallbacks for my system mechanics. You need to have fallbacks in your story. For example, when you're being told to go get an item, what happens if the item is lost or sold so you don't have it anymore? Is the quest failed? Is there a possibility to find it again? These are things you have to figure out before you start the quest. Now, you can always put in system mechanics to try to prevent this. Maybe items marked as quest items can't be sold or destroyed. And that's one way to do it. But if you try to do that on the Rescue the Merchant quest, you end up with that this NPC is marked as essential and cannot be killed, which I don't like, and I know a lot of you don't like. So instead, what I try to think of is come up with some alternate way for that quest to end, and maybe even incorporate it into an end slide later if the merchant gets killed. Maybe he was the only one who sold a particular kind of item, so you're not going to get that item anymore. So if you can't craft it, too bad for you. Maybe the story can't proceed a certain way, so there will be an end slide about his death. These are fine. Players love the fact that the game will react to what happened and not a set thing that everybody who does it has this exact same thing happen. That's not as interesting. So, in other words, don't tell the player what to do or where to go. Just tell them what the goal is and let them figure out where to go and what to do. It's a game. That is much more fun. Now, this can quickly get out of control. And I've talked about this before, but basically you have to keep it simple. All the different ways you have of solving a quest, you have to keep it simple. Try to keep it systemic, meaning it's not something that you have to hand script for this particular situation. For example, if you're asked to get this item and it's already something that's craftable, great. You already have a system for getting it. If it's not craftable, but you can put it in loot drops for creatures in the area, great. Just add the item to the loot drops and boom, the player has some way of going to get the item. If you want a unique particular item, then you're going to have to go put it in the inventory of some known guaranteed to spawn creature. And you can do that too. Where it gets more difficult is if you, like I mentioned with the goblins, they want you to do something for them or they're bribable or whatever. Because now you have to write a dialogue. That would be the one solution to this quest that's going to require hand scripting. And trust me, your time is going to be filled with making and debugging scripted solutions to all your quests. So you want most of those solutions to be systemic because those can be tweaked easily and fixed. Where the hand scripted ones, each one, since it's a script unique to this situation, each one you fix it and you still have to fix all the others because they have their own scripts too. Plus, you're often restricted if there's a particular dialogue for this quest, since dialogues get localized into other languages early and get locked. You often can't change those. So if you have a unique scripted solution that involves dialogue, you're going to have to find those bugs early. Which is another reason I say try to keep it systemic. Stories that try too hard to force the player to do one thing or go one way and solve it in a particular way, it makes players feel railroaded. And in an RPG where players, in theory, you're saying, hey, you get to play how you want. You get to make up a character in your head and play them the way you want. You want to give them a lot of options. If you force them to play a certain way, if the only way to do a quest is this one solution, especially if it's a main quest, if it's a side quest, they're like, I'm not going to do it. Oh, if my only option is to kill all those goblins, I'm just not going to do it. But if it's the main quest and they've decided to be a pacifist and you're making them kill every goblin to rescue that merchant, that's going to feel really, really bad. So that's why I say try to add something else. Have the quest you can do for them or let you bribe them, because that's a way that pacifist player has of getting through there. So I guess the bottom line is set up situations with multiple ways through them, tell the player a goal, and then just let the events unfold any way they want. Now that alone is a cool way of doing an RPG. But if you account for the different ways the player can do it, if you just keep a record, it can be an achievement, it can be a dialogue choice, it could be a flag that some script sets when it notices the player did something. And then later on in the story, you can have NPCs refer to those flags so they can change what they say. If you want to make an end game story, an end slide that changes based on what the player did in the story, that's even better, because that tells the player the game is really watching me and the game is changing and I get to be who I want, and that changes my game compared to my friend's game. But also it adds so much replayability. You get to the end of the game, thanks Windows, you get to the end of the game and you're like, I'm going to play that again, and this time I'm going to save that merchant. I'm not going to let him die. Or I'm not going to sell that quest item. I'm going to turn it in. Because it's just that's fun. That's role-playing games to me. And I think if you focus on that, I think you'll have a much better story. So, Moji XOXO, I hope that's the best answer I can give on how gameplay can influence stories by just making those stories goal based and not event based. So I hope that answers your question.